Kethevane, Gorjestani, who's with me. Kethevane, more and more strikes in on these Kurdish groups on the border there between Iraq and Iran. Why are they being targeted? Explain it to us.
Well, look, because these Kurdish Iranian groups have said that they are preparing, that they are moving closer to the border between Iraq and Iran, and that they are on standby for a possible military operation crossing the border into Iran. This threat is serious enough that the Iranians have, through their state media, denied reports that there were already several armed Kurdish groups that were crossing into Iran. It hasn't happened so far, but as you see on this map, the Kurds, they're really spread over several countries, but specifically in what we're talking about, it's their position in northern Iraq, in Kurdish Iraq, where you have those Iranian Kurds that could potentially go into Iran. And Ali Larijani, who's the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, he said that separatist groups should not think that a breeze has blown and try to take action. We will not tolerate it. The Iranians in talks with the Iraqi central government to try to secure that border, telling the Iraqis, you need to control your side of the border to prevent those Iranian Kurds from crossing over into our territory. The worry here is that, as you said, these Iranian Kurdish groups, they're armed. They're thousands of members. They are seen as heavily organized and the most organized of the opposition to the Iranian regime. Now, they're probably not strong enough to take on Iranian military or the Iranian security forces. They're probably not powerful enough politically either to take over Iran if the regime were to stumble. However, they could cause quite a bit of problems for the Iranian regime, because by crossing the border, for example, they will force Iranian forces to take them on that border, making them easier to target by the Americans, by the Israelis. They're also going to have to turn their focus to a second front, if you will, and that means that the Iranian military will have to focus on that border, and that will take away some of the focus of how do you protect yourself, how do you retaliate to the Israeli and the American attacks, and that is why they're so focused on that small border and on those groups.
How strong is the US backing for these Kurds? Because the Kurdish groups in Iraq have long worked with the US, haven't they?
Yes, and there are several US media reports that claim that Donald Trump and his administration have been in talks with the Kurdish leaders and have been helping those Iranian Kurdish groups over a little bit of time. There was a response yesterday by the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She was asked about these reports. She confirmed the fact that Donald Trump had been in talk with Iranian Kurdish leaders, but only said that those talks were focused on the U.S. base in northern Iraq. And she said that the rest, this idea that the Americans were planning for these groups to cross over in Iran and attack Iranian forces, was completely false. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he said this. He said, none of our objectives are premised on the support or the arming of any particular force. So what other entities are doing, we are aware of, but our objectives aren't centered on that. That's not exactly denying that the U.S. is helping those groups or in discussions with those groups. However, the media reports in the U.S. are really focused specifically on how the CIA might be helping those Iranian Kurdish groups. The reporting there is that the CIA, which is present in northern Iraq with an outpost, has been for a while now, before the start of the war in Iran, helping transfer weapons to these Iranian Kurdish groups. There has been no confirmation by the CIA or by the Trump administration, but the idea is that the U.S. could count on these groups to create problems, to create chaos for the Iranian government. There is, however, some questioning within the U.S., according to that reporting, as to how much they can trust those Kurdish groups, because there are plenty of them and they're not necessarily agreeing on everything amongst each other. There's also a little bit of mistrust coming from the Kurds themselves, themselves towards the Americans because, yes, there has been a long tradition of those two sides working together, but the Kurds also know that there's been a long tradition of the Americans leaving them out to dry. For example, in Iraq back in the 90s, or in Syria more recently, whether it was under Donald Trump's first term or more recently in the last few months. So they do want to work together because they seem to have the same enemy, but at the same time, they're not necessarily fully 100% trusting each other.